Hello and welcome to this installment of Vox Machina. As your narrator, I'll be bringing fantastic works of fiction from the page to your eardrums. Uploads will be posted weekly, so be sure to subscribe and hit the alerts bell to be notified when new installments are available. Got a story you think deserves the Vox Machina treatment? Let me know in a comment and you might just hear it in a future episode. Thanks for listening and on with the show. Every New Beginning by Fencer X. Episode 19. Despite the moving staircases being unusually compliant, Harry still wound up slipping into the charms classroom 3 minutes late, but Flitwick pretended not to notice as he slinked over to his seat next to Ron. "What did I miss?" he asked as Flitwick proceeded to charm a dress to mend its own rip, the needle lazily threading through the fabric as it stitched the hole closed. Ron gave him a sidelong look. Just a His words cut off, and he made a funny noise in his throat like he'd just swallowed a snidget, seizing up next to Harry. Several pairs of eyes swiveled over to them, and Flitwick frowned, dropping his wand. "Are you quite all right, Mr. Weasley?" Ron waved him away, a bright smile pasted on his lips. "I'm fine, Professor. Grand." Flitwick inclined his head, and once he'd turned back to his swishing and flicking, Harry prodded Ron gently. "Why, what's wrong?" Ron fixed him with a look of desperate betrayal, pointing to Harry's neck and hissing, There's on your—" His shoulders slumped and he whined softly, "Mate." Harry brought his hand up reflexively, brushing his fingers over where Ron had pointed, and blanched. He had a good idea what had caught Ron's eye. He swallowed and said, because he could think of nothing else on the fly, "It's from care of magical creatures." "What?" "We were dedoxing the Thestral Barn. Hagrid's got a funny affinity for beasts that are better left alone, sure, but I really don't reckon he had you necking with the little book." Ow! Hermione had just elbowed him sharply from Ron's other side, and the Ravenclaws present were all giving the three of them looks that promised swift retribution if they didn't start showing their head of house the proper respect as he lectured. Harry sank low in his chair, feigning a fervent interest in the household charms they'd been studying all week. He certainly hadn't been trying to keep his liaisons with Draco from his friends, but he sure as hell hadn't gone out of his way to let them know what sorts of things they got up to in the room that were decidedly not Newt relevant material. Besides, how were they to know it was Draco? Perhaps Ron was just sore Harry hadn't immediately informed his best friend he'd found a companion with whom he could do a bit of that canoodling Ron and Hermione seemed to enjoy. Perhaps— oh, who was he kidding? Of course Ron knew it was Draco. This Harry surmised from the fact Ron had awkwardly angled himself in his chair so as to place his back to Harry for the remainder of the lesson. He'd nearly thrown a fit at the mere thought of Harry inviting Draco into the common room for post-Quidditch merriment. It was a wonder he hadn't started vomiting slugs again at the sight of the love bite branded on Harry's neck. There was nothing to be done for it during charms, though, so Harry kept his head down and did his level best not to attract any more attention until Flitwick dismissed them for their afternoon free period. Draco would be in classes until dinner time, so there was no point in rushing back to the room. But all the same, Harry kind of wanted to make a quick exit until he figured out just how you broke it to your best mate. You might have taken the phrase, "keep your enemies closer," entirely too literally. He needn't have worried, though. Ron was out the door like a shot before Flitwick's voice had even died away, nearly tripping over his own 2 feet in his rush. Harry opened his mouth to call him back, then recalled he hadn't a clue where to start. Space was what they needed anyway. He'd find Ron after dinner, and then they'd have a nice, long, terribly awkward chat, and this would be something they laughed about when Harry inevitably found his way back to the future. "Hey, remember that time? Like it was literally yesterday, mate." Those would be the days. "On your feet, Harry Potter," someone hissed in his ear, and he abruptly found himself jerked from his chair by a vice-like grip on his arm. Hermione's fingers were digging painfully into the meat of his bicep as she dragged him from the classroom, her March 1 of a witch on the warpath. He let himself be manhandled out the door and down the hallway until Hermione found an unused classroom and shoved Harry through the door, locking it tight behind them with a spell whose counter Harry did not know. He glanced about, squinting in the dim light, and belatedly realized this was the same unused potion slab into which Draco had dragged Harry to rough him up for meddling in Lucius's dispensation. Damn. Nothing good ever happened to him in here. "Are you out of your mind, Harry James Potter?" And, they'd graduated from first and family names to full names now. She was going to rip him to pieces. "You'd better have a damn good explanation." No. She threw her hands into the air. There is no explanation. There is no excuse for you getting involved with Draco Malfoy. I let the DA business go. I let you skive off research. I let Christmas come and go because I trusted you. I trusted that you genuinely had the best of intentions, that things would work out because for you somehow they always do. And now this? Her voice went high and manic at the end, and between her dancing eyes and her bushy head of hair, she looked not a little bit mad. And you'd better be glad I'm the one in here right now, because if Ron weren't still reeling, he'd be trying to beat some sense into you, or else be rummaging through Slughorn's stores trying to find a bezoar to shove down your throat and counteract what he's desperately hoping is a love potion you've been slipped. Harry finally found his voice. I haven't been slipped. Of course you haven't. He isn't stupid. He just thinks that maybe if he doesn't acknowledge it, then it isn't really happening. She leaned back against one of the desks, rubbing her face with a groan. Harry, I'm serious. What were you thinking? He did not say the first thing that came to mind, that he hadn't been thinking. He also did not say how he didn't see what there really was to think about. It just happened. It's really not... How long? Huh? How long since it just happened? Are we talking right before you showed up for charms, or longer term? Well, I guess it was around when his dad died. She groaned. Harry, that was over a month ago! Well, yeah, I mean, it's not going terribly, so... She covered her ears, shaking her head. No, I don't want to hear about it, for so many reasons, several of which have nothing to do with damaging the timeline. It's only... She darted forward, taking his hands in her own and peering up at him with wide brown eyes. She looked tired, not quite as tired as she'd look 7 years hence after the ministry had started draining her and demanding more and more and more, but nearabouts. A pang of guilt twisted in his stomach, and he half wished he hadn't kissed Draco in the first place. She was running herself ragged for him, and here he was, inadvertently and with the very best of intentions, making matters even more difficult. Harry, I don't think you're really considering. Considering what? He hoped they weren't about to row over whether or not Draco deserved Harry's attentions again. He'd already had it from her and Ron at Christmas, and if they couldn't see Draco's worth, that was their loss. Considering the consequences. He rolled his eyes. God, I know there might be consequences, but I highly doubt... I don't mean with the timeline, Harry. She gave him a long look, brows raised hopefully as she seemed to will him to put the pieces together, before deciding to do as she always did and spell it out for him. I mean when you go back. Harry stiffened, straightening with a frown. Well, of course, I mean... He didn't know what he meant, though, because her words were still ringing in his ears. When you go back. And of course not a day had gone by that he hadn't thought about it. About how he wasn't meant to be here, how this was temporary until he got Draco up on his feet and could then focus on getting back to his proper time. And while he had always known he would miss the new friends he'd made, Zabini was actually pretty laid back, claiming that stress was shit for the complexion, and even Parkinson had mellowed out a bit since trying to get the entire school to turn him over to Voldemort. Probably Parvati's influence, bless her. This was the first time he thought he might actually have regrets. He'd miss out on 7 years of time with these people. Ron and Hermione he would always have a history with, and Ginny and Luna and Neville and everyone. But the new DA members? The Slytherins? Draco? There'd be so much time lost. So many memories he wouldn't have. Milestones he would miss. Achievements he wouldn't be there to celebrate. Well, that just figured, didn't it? He'd come here, admittedly accidentally, to try and avoid having regrets. But he was going to leave with heaps of them, all the same. I wasn't thinking. I mean, it's not like I meant to. I know, she said, soft with understanding. But you need to think about it, now, because the longer this goes on, the more it's going to hurt when you leave. Hurt the both of you. Harry felt his ears burning as he ducked his head. It's not that serious, and Draco... She covered her ears again, yelping, Harry Potter, I told you, I don't want details! She then let her arms fall back to her sides, fixing him with a look that was half pity, half fondness. Whatever you may think is happening, I feel confident it's nothing close to what's actually going on. Harry wrinkled his nose at the implication. Now that's not fair. Harry, let's not embarrass the both of us by you finishing that sentence and making me bring up all the instances you showed that to be a perfectly fair assessment of your emotional intelligence. She sighed, crossing her arms over her chest. You know what I'm going to tell you now, right? He did, in fact, know, because it was the same thing she said most every time they spoke these days. Still, if Ron could get away with ignoring uncomfortable truths, then so could Harry. That we should be using protection spells? Hermione's knees buckled, and she gripped the edge of the table to keep her wobbling knees from giving out. She swallowed thickly, then said very slowly, Part of me wants to say that, yes, of course you should be using those. And another part of me desperately wants to obliviate myself, so I forget you even suggested that you and Draco Malfoy were canoodling? Harry offered, because now that he could see his friends weren't going to disown him for behaving like a teenager with someone who'd made their school lives a living hell, he wanted to see how far he could stretch their goodwill. She pursed her lips. You promised me, Harry, by Christmas. And you seemed like things were delicate after the new term, which I can see now was a drastic underestimation of the actual situation, so I let it drag on a bit longer than I really should have, but you have to. You have to go to McGonagall about this now. Tell her the truth. Get the Ministry involved if necessary, and get back to when you belong. But, he started, not entirely sure how he was going to finish. A good thing, as Hermione didn't let him. Our research has turned up bunk. Not that you'd know, since you're never around these days, leaving me and Ron to do all the dirty work. He did not make a joke about all the dirty work he and Draco had been getting up to in their own ways, but he very much wanted to. But funnily enough, all the books on magical creatures capable of rearranging timelines are very hard to get hold of, legally or otherwise. She drew close, laying a hand on Harry's arm and squeezing gently. Maybe you've gotten used to being back here. Maybe you like being here more than in your own time, for whatever reason. He tried not to wince as her words hit his target dead on, but he didn't know if he'd been successful. But Harry, it's time. It really is. This problem is bigger than any of us, so it'll require more than just us to solve. This isn't Horcruxes. We can ask for help, and I think we have to. And Harry knew that she was right. She usually was, being Hermione, and he didn't always agree with her, not at first at least, but that didn't have much bearing on whether or not she knew what she was talking about. He pinched the bridge of his nose, lifting up his glasses to scrub at his eyes. Listen, I don't want you to think that I don't well know I'm not meant to be here, and that every day I spend here, every hour, every minute, is more time I have to change something, whether I mean to or not, that can't be undone. Some things, I think should be changed. Some bits of the future should be undone. So I guess we'll have to agree to disagree that just because it happened once one way, it has to happen the same way again. But I know I've got to go back. He stopped short of confirming her subtle accusation that maybe a small part, infinitesimal really, didn't entirely mind if he wound up stuck here, having to live the past 7 years all over again, armed with enough knowledge he could make sure all the terrible things that had come to pass before didn't this time around. I do, really. His shoulders slumped. I still don't feel like I've done enough for him. He still hasn't got a clue what he wants to do with his life or how I can help him make sure he avoids any entanglements that'll set him on the path to the kissing chamber, and it's not even been a month since he lost his dad. Harry, she started gently but firmly, you must understand it's not your job to— I know it's not my job. Don't you think I realise that? Don't you think I know that this has jack all to do with Aurora? He crossed his arms petulantly. Ron's not the only one who deals with uncomfortable situations by just not talking about it. She seemed taken aback, and Harry didn't blame her. He hadn't quite meant to say that, not least because he hadn't really acknowledged it anywhere outside his own head before. That, there was something special, something ineffably intriguing, a draw, a pull, all right, an obsession, about Draco Malfoy that some innate part of Harry refused to let him ignore, even at peril to his own life. Perhaps it was for the best Draco not come auraing with him in the future. There was no telling how further distraction might affect his evidently already poor work performance. I have to do this. I have to. If I go back and nothing's changed, then I'll regret it for the rest of my life. He shook his head. I know I can't stay here indefinitely. I can't hold his hand the whole way, and eventually I'll have to let him stand on his own 2 feet. And I will. Just not yet. Please don't ask me to yet. This is my one shot, Hermione. One chance to save his life. I need to do it right. Hermione scuffed the toe of her loafer on the floor with a frown, arms crossed over her chest, and she sighed. I'd be tempted to suspect he really had drugged you with a love potion of some sort by how dramatic you're being about all this, but I know well from experience this is just Harry Potter on a Tuesday. She sighed. If you won't go to McGonagall right away, then I need you to do something for me. Anything. She fixed him with a hard look, and he immediately regretted his words. Talk to him. Harry frowned. Ron? Malfoy, of course. You do talk, don't you, between all your canoodling? Of course Harry sputtered, ears burning. You know we do. Good. Then it shouldn't be any great trial to do so now. Tell him our research has turned up nothing, that we're at a dead end. See what he thinks you ought to do. It's his life, after all, and I think he deserves some say in how much more meddling he must endure from you. Harry's jaw hardened. You know what he'll say. No, I don't. And neither do you. You won't until you ask him. You do know. You know how he is, as well as I do. We grew up with him, for God's sake. The stubborn little prick will send me away, even though there's still good I can do here. He'll do it because he'd rather fail on his own than ask for help and succeed. He's his own worst enemy, and you want me to give him a weapon? No, I want you to talk to him. I feel like you probably don't do enough of that either way, with or without the canoodling. Talk about why you're here. Talk about when you plan to leave. Talk about what he can do to help you get back to when you need to be. He is stubborn and a prick. I'll certainly give you that. But he's also reasonably clever, and you could use a bit of cool calculation to quench your fiery boneheadedness. Harry patted his hair reflexively. I'm not a bonehead. You're a little bit of a bonehead, Harry, but Malfoy seems to like you all the same, so there's that. She shook her sleeve, and a black hairband slid down to her wrist. She used it to attempt to tame her bushy locks into something more manageable. So, will you speak to him? He has arithmancy in the afternoon, or runes, or something. I'm actually not even sure he's actually taking half the classes he claims he is. Talk to him, Hermione said again, giving his shoulder a shove as she made for the door. And then find some time to talk to Ron, too, if you can. You think Ron will even speak to me? She shouldered the door open. He will if he ever wants to canoodle again. And then she was gone, and Harry was left alone, with rather a lot of thinking to do before he did any manner of talking with anyone.